Hi there and welcome to the business edition of PM Express with me, Philip Nanfuri. Now on Tuesday the 10th of September, Joy Business hosted its third Financial Services Forum and we titled it The Financial Services Sector Cleanup. Now what? Now what was meant to emphasize that since August 2017, the Ghana's financial system has undergone a great number of reforms, and to some who are very familiar with history, this is not the first time Ghana's financial sector has, for lack of a better word, been on a tumble. We've had a lot of changes from the number of banks being reduced. We also had changes in the securities industry. We saw a number of fund managers also fold up. We saw the SEC go hard on them with a number of notices, asking them to stop guaranteed returns. And the main crux of the matters in the financial sector, the confidence the people have in the system. There have been liquidity challenges, and the story keeps on going on and on. But at each point, the regulator tells us that all is well and good. And Joy Business Desk decided to ask the question, now what? What next? We've had all these talk shops, we've been on air. This very show, we've discussed the sector over and over and over again. So beyond all the talk, beyond all the discussions, beyond all the reforms, what next for Ghana's financial sector? We need sustainable reforms that will stand the test of time. Beyond 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, beyond the current administration, the current government whatsoever, we must ensure that the financial sector still stands the test of time. So we held this forum, we brought together players from all over in the financial sector, from the banks, specialized deposit-taking institutions, securities industry, insurers, auditors, etc., just to deliberate and discuss. And on tonight, we want to put some of these issues into perspective. And some of our guests and panelists brought some solutions to the challenges we've experienced. We want to subject this to some academic analysis and see if indeed this will yield results. So I have in studio with me Dr. Lord Mensah. He's an economist and financial analyst. I'm sure you are well aware or well informed. I beg your pardon, you are, how do I put it? You are familiar with Dr. Lord Mensah and some of his contributions in the media space when it comes to matters of economics, finance, and business. But I want to start off our discussion first and foremost on Dr. Daniel Sedo. He made an intervention during this forum, and he says we should look at capping or placing a number of the number of institutions, banks in the country. Let's listen to that and set the ball rolling.
Banks and other financial institutions came when the big ones were not responding to us as customers well. I think banks and other financial institutions came when the big ones were not responding to us as customers well.
We apologize for that. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. Right, thanks for staying with us. So I'm going to cut straight to Dr. Lord Mensah on our first thematic area. This was a recommendation by Dr. Daniel Sedo. Like I said, he's a financial consultant and chartered accountant. And he was asking that we look at the number of banks in the country. We've come down from 36 to 23 banks over a course of 2 years. In 2017, the total number of banks in the country were 36. As we speak, we have 23 banks. 14 of these banks are foreign controlled and 9 are domestic controlled. Dr. Lord Mensah, 36 to 23. Some would argue that the consolidation the Bank of Ghana was looking for when they announced this minimum capital requirement, they've achieved it. We've really cut down the number of banks. But should we start looking at a situation where we place a number on, or a cap, I beg your pardon, on the number of banks in the country? Or we should subject it to the market and allow the market to determine it? What would be your argument there?
Well, for me, I think it should be purely market, i.e., the market should determine whether we need more banks or not. Now, as we speak now, we've had, mobile money penetration. Mobile money is getting to the remote. Now, remember, the number of hours these mobile money operators can keep the funds that are coming to them is quite limited. They need to get into the financial system.
Yeah.
So we cannot afford to say we are coming to cap banks. We are still penetrating as far as banking is concerned, as far as how finance will get to the remote is concerned. So if you cap it and it turns up that all these 23 are operating within the triangular economic, structures of this country, I mean Accra, Takoradi, and then what do we call it? Kumasi. Then it means you are limiting those who are outside this triangle. So effectively, we cannot cap it, but rather we should make sure that at the entry point, the requirement that is needed for you to enter is placed on the table before you can enter. So for me, it's not about capping it. We should allow the market to determine it, but then in the end, it's a matter of respecting the rules on the grounds as far as establishing banking is concerned. Establishing bank is concerned. Now, if you look at the happenings in the past, realize that the governor, in the first announcement for bringing those seven banks, the CBG.
Yes, 5 banks, then 2 at the end of the year. Yeah.
Bringing the 7 together, he made mention that some started on false pretense. Now, when you take every financial space, there's something we call arbitrage. Those who come in with nothing, but they want to go home with something. There's no way you can take them out of the market. They are part of the system. They come to provide lessons. Now, we've come to a point where we know that some people can start banking without anything and still go home with something. Now, what are we putting in place to curb this going forward? So for me, it's a matter of looking at the entry point. Those who are coming in should be of quality. They should meet all the criteria. And in fact, those who are working, right, those who are making sure that the regulation works, are supposed to be the people who are supposed to respect the contract that has been given to them. When we talk about corporate governance, we shouldn't think corporate governance starts from the banking hall. No, it does not start from the directors of the banks and then the CEO and then possibly the entire shareholders. No, it starts all the way from the regulatory level. Every structure that you have as a financial system is made up of structures of contract. Now, if each and every player within this structure respect the contract that has been given to him, I think we will have a sound financial system. The reason why I'm saying we should respect the contract that has been given to each and every one within the financial system is that when you take a regulator employs people. The people that have been employed have contract with the regulator. There's a contractual agreement. One is a principal, the other is an agent. Yeah. You have to keep to the relationship. Make sure that you don't falter as far as this contract is concerned. Roll this to the point where that agent that has been hired is going to supervise a bank. Now, the regulator is paying you purposely to go and supervise the bank. There's a contractual agreement, well spelled out. Make sure that you respect the contract. What is required of the bank, you keep it. Now, you're a director of a bank. That director has a contract with shareholders, has contract with the CEO. With the shareholders' perspective, the director is what? Is an agent. He has to perform to the needs of what? This shareholder.
Yeah.
You go further from from those directors to the CEO, there's a contract. Now, beneath the CEO, there are people who are operating. There's a finance operations officer, we have a marketing officer. All these structures are full of contract, all the way up to the employees. And I always say that even the employees, to the extent of your wife and your kids sending you to work, is a contract you have with them. So if we are to respect these structures of contract within the financial space, I think we would like to have, a good financial system. And this is a situation where, we've had banks that have come together. And I think when banks come together, there's no way 2 managers can be kept at the same level. At least one will go. And you are going home because you did not respect a contract to a certain level. If you are at the regulator level and you are being chased after because maybe you took certain decisions that, that has brought us to this level, it's because you never respected, the contract that was given to you.
And
so
I think
for me, it's about respecting the contractual structures within the financial space.
And I think, Doc, your points are very similar to what Alhassan Andani said, MD of Stanbic Bank and President of the Ghana Association of Bankers. He says the crisis we experienced is a credibility issue. People failed.
It's an attitudinal issue.
People failed to follow due process, like what you're saying. Yeah. They had their contractual relations and obligations, and then they failed to do that. Let's now listen to Dr. Daniel Sedor on what exactly he had to say about this capping number of banks, and we'll set the ball rolling.
I think banks and other financial institutions came when the big ones were not responding to us as customers well, when they started bluffing us, then it created gap for other people to come in. If the banks are efficient and doing well, I don't think we'll have too many of them. Now, the deposit that you are supposed to mobilize, it's not there, it's not cheap. With technology, the MOMOs, it's creating all kinds of problems. With the asset management entities, the mutual funds, they are creating problems for the banks in terms of mobilization. So we should have the conversation to limit the number of banks we should have. We've seen the situation where, because of the other influence, people walk in, submit applications, and they are approved. Till we work on that, we would have problems.
That was Dr. Daniel Sedor making his submissions at the recently ended third edition of the Joy Business Financial Services Forum. And Dr. Lord Mensah, he makes a point that if we have a few number of banks operating efficiently, we wouldn't need a 23 or even a large number like 36 that we saw. Would you agree with Dr. Sedor on this?
Well, I don't really agree on that, because if you say if we're to have small number of banks working efficiently, how many banks did we have earlier? We had 36. Now we've narrowed it to what do we call it, 23. Now with this 23, what is the coverage? What is the clientele outreach? We need to assess that. It could be that the 23 that we find ourselves in now we have to incur more cost by expanding to the sectors that, earlier banks that were reaching to those. And you see, covering a particular area in banking comes with different expertise, comes with different focus. Now, you realize that GN Bank had a model of bank where it was just springing up.
Yeah.
So you ask yourself, are they reaching out to clients? Is this visibility of those remote, building up into shareholders' value? Those were the questions we're asking ourselves, every now and then. It might not be immediately, but then looking at long term, it might work. So if you say you are limiting it to 23, then it means you are keeping the 23 for them to metamorphose into different banks with different focus over time. But then every bank identifies a gap in the financial space and comes to fill it. I can come in and say, hey, my target is SMEs. SMEs who are into maybe agriculture. That is my target, and allow me to operate in that sector. If you force any of these banks that are existing to change their style of banking to go into these areas, it could be a flop for them. So for me, it's not a matter of restricting. We should allow the market to operate. But let's also note this. The influx of banks in this country in the past years before we had these reforms wasn't necessarily because, maybe the system was not efficient. But then I believe that genuinely people came to the market to survive, but they couldn't. Others too came to dupe the system. That's how I see it. Now, we live in a country where we had interest rates soaring.
Yeah.
To a level where, anybody that comes into the financial sector with any investment will be able to take home something. And that was when we saw this influx. And remember, during those times that interest rates were high, whilst the banks were coming in, appetite for investors on interest-bearing facilities were also growing. Because you can decide not to put your money in any real asset and put your money in a fixed deposit. That's to gain something. So the bank saw that. If you go by the numbers, you realize that the banks were even taking savings up to 15%, investing somewhere around 35%, sometimes 25% into a government instrument. So banking became so easy. Let me put it that way. You can bank even in your hall, where you take people's savings around 18%, give it out around 32%, and still make what? A spread out of it.
True.
So for me, banking became so easy during those times. And that is why we saw those influx. But then it's unfortunate we couldn't keep our eyes on the ground to ascertain the genuine ones that are coming in and the bad nuts that are in there to dupe the system.
Okay. You raised two key points in here. You mentioned GN Bank, and not to put GN Bank on the spot, but they are a local entity. And you also mentioned, I beg your pardon, And you also mentioned the influx into the system. Now, at this very forum, Alhassan Dani was speaking about the local foreign bank argument, and also he spoke about the fact that the systemic banks in the system held 90% of the assets, the deposits, etc. So the ones that went down held only 10% and below. So for him, the issue of crisis, it wasn't really a crisis. If we have Alhassan Dani's video, let's take a look at it and continue the conversation.
All the top 10 or top 12 banks that control 90% of the depositors' funds, loans and advances, and financial services. Not a single one went down. So when you start talking crisis, you are wishing bad things for yourselves. There was not a single stoppage in the delivery of financial services in Ghana. Never. The banks that were impacted controlled less than 10% of the loans and advances in this country. Financial services were never halted for an hour. Everybody who wanted financial services, whether local or domestic, international or domestic, had banking services. So your systemic banks were well catered for. The issue is that if you look at the systemic banks, a good number of them are domestic banks, they're local banks. I mean, well run. They take risk and they manage the risk. Let's move away from the fact that local means mediocre. Local means you can get away with things that are not industry standard. Let's move away from that. Whether it's in banking or anything that we do, we all attend the best courses. I'm sure if I say how many of you here attended Harvard, you'd see a lot of hands go up. So we've been to the best institutions in the world, and I said one of the best institutions I've worked with was SSB. It was very, very well run, and there was not a single expatriate there. I mean, again, I don't like, I mean, EcoBank, all of them, I ran Standard Bank. For the past, I don't know how many years, we have not had a single expatriate. Everybody is a Ghanaian. So it's about how we uphold our professional standards.
So that was Alhassan Dani. He's the MD for Stanbic Bank, and he's also the president of the Ghana Association of Bankers. And he's making the point that we should take out this notion where local banks are seen as mediocre. He also made the point that the systemic banks, the banks that hold the biggest assets, and Dr. Lomensa will break it down for us. These banks held the assets and nothing stopped. No delivery, the delivery of financial services never ceased. The little banks that went down, if I can say so, held a few or, yes, 10% of the total assets. So nothing really happened there. I don't know what Doc feels about this. Let's start off with the systemic bank issue. He is making the argument that delivery of financial services never stopped,
yes,
which is the truth.
Yes, true.
We still accessed our credits. I still went, I opened my account, I withdrew. So what is the lesson in here when it comes to this financial sector, particularly on the banking side?
I think the question that was posed to him was about whether we're in crisis, it was
Yes.
a banking crisis or not. And for me, it wasn't, banking crisis, in a sense that if we talk about crisis, it means the effect or the systemic failure should sweep across all the institutions, for which if the government should come out with bailout, it should go for almost every institution within the system. But that's not what we saw in the past. We saw entity-specific failures. And all the failures came with different characteristics. Some are corporate governance issues, some are overexposure, some are concentration of loans to a particular sector, government or rented, facilities and all those. Those are the things that cripple the economy. So if individual banks are not managing well, and in the end it costs them their solvency, I won't call it, crisis. Yes, I won't call it crisis. But then if you look at whether, the market is dominated by foreign companies, foreign banks, or, local banks, for me, it's not an argument we need to place so much. We could have, local banks, all right, but then in terms of client outreach, in terms of policy focus that we want our country to move, we can still use them. It doesn't matter the numbers that we have. And the foreign, will target their sophisticated product here and there and all those. So for me, I don't believe in whether, the numbers are tilting towards, local banks or foreign banks. It's about reaching out to clients, how government can channel its policies in a direction that we want the country to grow generally. So I don't believe in those arguments.
Doc, on the local foreign banks bit, what about these arguments? Look at South Africa. The biggest banks there are South African-owned banks. When you come to our case, and I remember in this very forum, the former CEO of UT Bank, Prince Kofi Mabing, he made a point that what are we doing to support our local banks? Don't you think we should put Ghana in a map or in a place? And this has even been captured in the budget, where the finance ministry says they want to place Ghana as a financial services hub. Don't you think it would be good to have a local bank, like how GCB was one of the first banks, local bank, to start in this country? Don't you think we should have more of that in the system, where we look at it with pride and say these are banks that Ghanaians own and are big, like how the Nigerian banks are within our shores? The Zenith, the UBA, they've crossed borders. What about that?
Yes, I mean, for me, having a Ghanaian locally bank moving beyond borders should be the target, or it should be the hallmark. But then we shouldn't forget that having foreign banks in your economy in itself can bring about some advantages. And some of the advantages is that they can bring about, competition of funds, thereby forcing interest rate down. It could also be that they bring in some standards of practice that are coming from elsewhere that will be good. Best practices elsewhere that will be good for the economy. So for me, we shouldn't create it as if we shouldn't create the environment as if the presence of foreign banks is a disadvantage. On the other hand, foreign banks also pay taxes to the system. Now, if government thinks, for a point where you want to skew policies towards local banks, I mean, there are so many means you can go about it. You can slap the foreign banks with taxes here and there and ensure that, you bring your local banks up, or whatever you generate from the foreign banks can go into other sectors of the economy to grow the economy. But as to whether we should go international, having Ghanaian bank going to America, having Ghanaian bank going to South Africa, I think it should be the motivation going forward.
Doc, let me put you on the spot a bit. If you were the regulator and you had a choice to solve two of these key issues, the capping or the number of banks in the system and the foreign local bank debate, what would be your action if you were supposed to present a paper to us as governor today? What would be your action for these two issues, the capping of the banks and then the local foreign banks?
I think a lot will go into that decision. It won't be a decision that you pick on the spot and say, I'm going to cap, number of banks in the country, or I'm going to make sure that the structures within the banking structure within the economy is dominated by local banks or not. A lot of research needs to go into it. I mean, it won't be something that we will sit down and say one day or overnight or in a minute I have to decide on which direction should the bank go. So that won't be a question to pick immediately. But I think you will need some input, you need some feed on the ground over some number of months, some number of years to get to know which policy you will go for, whether to cap it or not. But for me, I'm not in favor of capping the number of banks because of the penetration of mobile money across the country. And then also, if you ask me whether I should, turn around, the structures of this banking structure and make it more foreign. Now, you can have less number of local banks, but then the client outreach for local banks is more than foreign banks. So it's not about the number of banks that as you look. You have to look at the coverage. I can tell you that the local banks are covering more than, the foreign banks. Most of the foreign banks are operating in the trials. I mean, looking at Accra, looking at Takoradi and then Kumasi. How many banks are operating at the district levels compared to commercial bank in this country? Sure. So for me, I think it's not about the numbers that we see in-house or in the country, looking at foreign banks 14 and then local banks 9. It's about the coverage,
the outreach.
Yes, the outreach.
Okay. Speaking of Bank of Ghana, an issue came up there on governance, and two key personalities spoke there. Dr. Richmond Etuahene corporate governance and banking consultant, spoke, and Mrs. Marian Bano, she's also a corporate governance consultant and a lawyer. They also spoke. I want us to listen to Dr. Richmond Etuahene, then we'll see what we can deduce from there and have a solid argument around that. So let's listen to Dr. Etuahene.
Worry is about enforcement and compliance. The whole issue that we have at stake at the moment is poor enforcement and lack of compliance. If you look at the first, the Banking Act 674, 2004, all these things were there. Corporate governance was there. The BSDI, the 2016, is only elaborating it. The laws were very good. And I think in this country, what is killing us and will continue to kill us until we begin to talk about enforcement, compliance, and sanctions. You see, the sanctions that we sanction them to penal point. I mean, I remember HSBC when they flooded the AML rules in America.
Right, so that was Dr. Etuahene, and I do apologize for the poor quality of the sound. But his main argument, and together with Mrs. Marian Bano, was a structural change in the legal framework surrounding the Bank of Ghana. And on the point of corporate governance, and I remember Mrs. Marian Bano made this point that we are pushing for a change in governance in the banks, where there should be a separation of the individuals. You can't be both MD of the bank and board chair. We should have a preponderance of independent non-executive directors on the boards of these banks, rather than just the normal executive and non-executive directors. And she raises the point that if you look at the Bank of Ghana, we have the governor as the head of the bank itself, running day to day, the governor as the board chair, and the head of the MPC. You have an individual, and not a particular individual, but governor, regardless of who it is, per the law, vested with all these powers. That in itself is a corporate governance issue or flaw. What will be the way forward for us? Some argue that this is so because they want to concentrate powers in the governor so that he's free to do his work. Some have made this argument. But what should be the way forward for this thing? Because I think most people agree that it's a failure or it's a flaw. What should be the way forward for this?
Yeah, I think if you look at the structures, within our banking space, especially at the regulatory level, clearly you could see duplication of powers, more or less looking at the governor reporting to himself. Because when the board takes decision, the central bank board takes decision, I mean, where does it go? Does it go to the president, or it ends up with the banking hall at the regulatory level? If it ends up at the regulatory level, then it means that the governor is reporting to himself, which within the corporate governance framework globally, global best practices, it's a flaw. So for me, if we have that's the structure as it exists now, then in that case, it won't be bad to relegate that powers of being a board chair to any of the deputies, and then being at the top for you to receive a fee from these operational deputies. And I think that would be a good structure for the country. But as it stands now, he's more or less duplicating himself, serving as a board, at the end of the day, see to day-to-day running of the firm, of the regulatory body. I think it's a flaw. So for me, that is what we need to look at. Go revisit our constitution, and if we can make amends, because we've been talking about corporate governance. Like I said in my earlier submission, corporate governance does not start from the banking hall. It starts all the way from the regulatory level. And if we want to appreciate the separation of the CEO at the banking hall to that of what the directors, okay, then we should do the same at the regulatory level for consistency purpose, to conform to global, best practices.
Because some of the guests made the argument that if you look at other jurisdictions, they mentioned the UK, they mentioned South Africa, we have a system that allows for, and I think, for example, the UK, the Bank of England, their board chair is different. He's a different individual. Then Mark Carney is the governor of the Bank of England. Sure. he's running the institution, things are going on well for them. So, and like, for example, another thing Dr. Atuani mentioned was the term of the governor. Will you think that in looking at these reforms or the changes, the governor's term is 4 years, renewable for another 4, so a total of 8. He feels tying it to the political 4 year, is a flaw in itself also.
Well, I don't see it that way. We've had situations where governor has had an overlap into, another, political regime. Just that you will not be comfortable on your job, so you have to resign. We've had that. So that 4 years mandate tying it to political, regimes, I won't buy into that. Because if you look at Issahaku, right?
Yeah.
His tenure wasn't, did not end, but he had to resign because he might not be comfortable working with, the political regime in place as of that time. So it's not just that. If you have genuinely an independent, governor, I mean, but an independent in quote, because at the end of the day, the governor is being appointed by the executive in place. But then if you are appointed and genuinely, right, you are independent, you should be able to, have your tenure eaten into another political regime. So it's not that, the tenures are, Bank of Ghana has their own internal structures that allow the governor to run across regimes. But then possibly you might not be comfortable working with, different regimes. So it calls for most of the time resignations here and there.
There is another issue I wanted to pick your brain on quickly, just on the issue of the regulation. We have 4 different regulators for the system. Another issue that came up there was also a relook at the financial regulation structure, moving away from the silo system where we have Bank of Ghana, NIC, SEC, and NPRA. Do you think where in our market development we necessarily need a different type of system, or we are okay? Because some were suggesting the Twin Peaks as is being done in other countries, where one institution is responsible for prudential regulation, one for market conduct. Yep. Do you feel like Ghana can make that push to a place, or we are okay where we are with the controls in the system?
But as it stands now, within Bank of Ghana's framework, we still have these structures where there's a unit in charge of financial market.
Yeah.
There's a unit in charge of forex. So we have those structures within the regulatory framework. However, if you want to link, it's a financial system for which, if you take the insurance, you take the savings and loans, you take the banking sector, you cannot dissociate the operations. One is picking funds from here, putting it in the other. So interconnectivity between these regulators, the NIC, the NPRA, the SEC, and then the BOG, is very, very key. How information flows. We don't need any apex, body to come and integrate them. You create another layer. And in this country, the more layers you create, the more you can cause a mess. So what we need, we have the structures. What we need now, as we speak, is how information flows. If an insurance company has invested in a particular, bank's instrument, we should know the concentration across. And Bank of Ghana has that obligation to make sure that that information flows across all these, regulatory, structures. And at the end of the day, because whatever we do, insurance premiums that we take, everything ends up in the bank.
In the banks, true.
So for me, it's not about creating another layer. It has to do with making sure that the information flows across all these, entities.
But the president recently put together this Financial Stability Advisory Council. Don't you think that's a step for information to flow amongst these? I think they have met twice.
Well, it is an advisory council, but that could be one of their proposals, to make sure that they put systems in place to get things across all these regulatory structures for us to benefit from it.
Okay. So another key thing that also comes up is the regulation proper, the laws in itself. Doc, And one of our panelists made a point that, for example, if you look at the Banks and Specialized Deposit Taking Institutions Act, it says if a bank is insolvent, the Bank of Ghana shall revoke the license. He believes, and that was Chuniba Kodiabuachi, he's Executive Secretary of the Savings and Loans Association. He feels like, you know what, let's look at a change in some of these laws, amendments to some of these laws to provide some room for restructuring. Also, the SEC also made a very good point. Reverend Obama was speaking, and he says his law, his enabling act is not punitive enough. Because if you look at the penalty units, one penalty unit is 12 cedis. So if somebody is charged a certain number, the person can literally just walk in, pay the money, and walk out. Yeah. Do you think we need to start looking at amendments? Because we just passed some of these laws. I mean, barely 2 years, 3 years down the line. Do you think we start looking at some of these laws to change them and make things better?
Yeah, that is very, very important to look at. You see, I always say that the structures that we have in our corporate governance framework, the 2018 one that came out, I was trying to look for it online this afternoon, but then I couldn't find it. I don't know what has happened to the Bank of Ghana's website.
They have redesigned their website,
so I mean, I look at it and I ask myself, what are the punitive measures? And then this takes me back to what has happened as we speak now, the reforms that we went through. I always say that until we brand those who, perpetrated some of this act that has brought us to this level, we cannot solve this problem. Because the memories of the investor is in such a way that until you plan something serious, there's no way, the investor will not have his memories faded, or an individual will not have his memories faded. However, if you plant something, planting something means extremes of punishment, where they know very well that I'm a potential investor. I know if someone takes my money in a dubious means, these are the punishment. Or I'm about to establish a financial institution. If I falter, these are the punishment lays ahead of me. There's no way we will not have these things that we are having now, not reoccurring. We're going to have it to reoccur. So for me, we have to come out clear. If you decide to enter into banking through fraud means, if you enter into banking through an opportunity that does not exist, you should be punished as such. And the punishment should be spelled out clearly to Ghanaians, potential investors, people who have their funds and they want to put them in the banks and then those institutions. So for me, I believe that we have to make things clear. Banking is about being open. Mm-hmm. I mean, bridging information asymmetry. If we don't come out with very good punitive measures, for me, we're going to have reoccurrence of people, having banks with false pretense and all those arbitrage situations, coming with nothing but wants to go home with something and all those.
Are you satisfied with the level of how people who were complicit in what went wrong, are you satisfied with what you are seeing and how these people are being brought to book?
For now, I'll tell you no. And I always say that until the way we handle the current, problems will determine whether it will reoccur or not. As we speak now, we don't have much happening in public. We don't have the assurance that we are giving to Ghanaians that in the end, this is what happened, this is what we've gotten out of it, these are the assets that we sold from those individuals, and that is what we're going to use to pay depositors or whatever, or the government is taking over and then try to find a way to get depositors' funds being paid and all that. All that we hear is that government has made provision to what? To take over people's deposit. But what has happened? The act of what? Taking people's deposit without having what? The right to invest it somewhere and then you put the money there. That is what we need to go back to. It's a criminal act. And until we make public, right, some of these trials that are going on, there's no way, we will not have it reoccurring. So for me, I'm not satisfied at all. Let things come out clear. Even if you want to telecast some of these trials that are ongoing, I believe Ghanaians will be satisfied. And you win the investor confidence with this. But as it stands now, things are being done at the side of the investor and potential investor. And for me, It does not make sense. You will not win the heart of these investors.
Doc wants to see more done.
Oh, yes.
This is the business edition of PM Express. My guest, Dr. Lord Mensah, economist and financial analyst. My name, Philip Nanfuri. We're taking a quick break. We'll be right back. Right, thanks for staying with us. This is the business edition of PM Express. I want us to move into another segment of our conversation. We have a notice from the Bank of Ghana regarding payment service providers, and you see it right there on your screen. Bank of Ghana has taken some moves to operationalize the Payment Systems and Services Act 2019, Act 987, and they are essentially spelling out some rules and regulations for players in this space. So the mobile money operators, the payment systems, and stuff like that. Let me just read some portions of it. And it says, licensing and authorization of payment service providers. The emergence of new payment streams, institutions such as financial technology companies, that's your fintechs, and the general acceptance of electronic money have necessitated the enactment of the Payment Systems and Services Act 2019, Act 987, to provide a legal and regulatory framework for the orderly development of the payment system. To operationalize Act 987, the Bank of Ghana hereby provides the minimum capital requirements, permissible activities, and fees for all categories of payment service providers and financial technology companies. And if you scroll down to the exact license types, permissible activities, capital required, let me just give you the first one. So, payment service provider, electronic money issuer. They have a capital of 20 million Ghana cedis, and their fees can take them a period of 5 years. And there are various categories for it. And below that also a number of procedures and processes, minimum governance requirements, minimum systems requirements. I'm just going to ask Doc if he thinks such a system or regulation is a step in the right direction, or it flies against the push to move us from a manual system to the electronic system. Doc?
Yes, I think whether we like it or not, fintech has come to stay. In fact, if you look at the financial transactions that goes through these platforms, they are so huge. And it goes with risk. Now, we should understand that most of these, not all of them, has to do with coding, has to do with programs. Now, these programs can be skewed in such a way that one day will be there and the entire funds will be in somebody's pocket, so, or somebody's account.
Yeah.
So for me, right, it's a step in the right direction. But then, you see, introducing capital requirement, right, for these institutions, these organizations, I would say might not necessarily be enough, because they are on the grounds. Is the Bank of Ghana building its capacity to get to know some of these fintech institutions, how robust they are, sometimes find a way to test their system, whether you can easily, compromise the system or not. Have we seen that? I went to Belgium, that's where I had my PhD, and I was having a discussion with my supervisor on this fintech. They have a model. Before you come out to operate on the market, they run you through an incubation. And with this incubation system are several, fintech companies for which they subject them to trials. So they go through rigors of tests for some number of years before they come out. So if you get hatched very well, test and tried through all means to make sure that your system cannot easily be compromised before you come out. Do we have such a system here in this country? Because these things are just mere codings here and there, for which we can easily compromise, transfers here and there. Yeah. So for me, fine. It's good that we've realized that they exist. We are introducing what? Minimum capital requirement, has a tenure of what? 5 years. Yes. So hopefully, maybe with time, I think we'll learn from that process. But then, just the capital requirement alone cannot minimize or mitigate the possible risk that we are likely to be exposed to.
And I'm sure, as time goes on, Bank of Ghana will do more to update us on the specifics within there.
Exactly.
But Doc, as we wind down on our conversation, and I can see you have your notes right in front of you, the crux of this conversation is the way forward.
Yeah.
We want solutions. I think we've had enough discussions as a country.
Yeah.
From Dr. Lord Mensah's desk, what does he think he can give to us as recommendations for the growth of the financial sector?
Well, I would say that the financial sector, or the system, is full of contract. And each and every individual that is playing a role within this contract, we need to respect it through. I mean, we should respect the engagement as principal, as agent, in all the facets of what? The financial space. Let's also not forget that, every, mishap in the financial space brings about new lessons. If you look at, corporate governance guidelines that has been introduced in the past, even Basel 1, Basel 2, now we are on Basel 3, it gives you an idea of the happenings and what we learn from it, okay? So possibly we need to accept that it's part of the financial dynamics, Every financial system gets to its peak and then find a way to come down as a result of, human interference, as a result of more practices, as a result of people wants to make more than necessary and all those. That brings about the system back to the it. But once you come down, it becomes a lesson process. We put down very good corporate governance structures. We put down framework. We put down, all measures, get to know the things that happened before we came here, and then make sure that we block it, going forward. And I think that should be able to, help us going forward. But let's also not forget about how we treat the current happenings. For me, naming and shaming and then prosecuting the violators of the existing laws that brought us to this level is very, very important. Even possibly, if we can brand violators to some of the happenings. So, the way the lawyers do their things, they can, case by case. Okay, between Lord and then Namfuri, it's a case that every, student comes to study. It stays with them. Okay. They know such a case has happened. So nothing prevents us to say that, okay, Capital Bank's issue. Lay out all the possible, more practices that, that brought Capital Bank to this level. As it stands now, we don't have any information. Things are hidden. We got the bigger framework, but then as to the specificities, we don't have. So branding violators to the happenings, I think should be able to, keep us in check, going forward. Without it, I think our memories will fade in terms of what is happening now, and we can easily go back to it, like what Piram, did, and the reoccurrence of all those. True. Yeah, so for me, that's what I can say.
Okay, but just in one sentence, my question to you: so far, where we are we well and good for the financial system?
For now, we are good. The difference is the uncertainties has been kept so long, so curing it will take a bit of longer time. But as it stands now, we are good.
Okay. This has been the business edition of PM Express. My name is Philip Nanfuri, and my guest, Dr. Lord Mensah, economist and financial analyst. I want to say a big thank you to all viewers and listeners for your time. Do have a good evening.